And that commitment to service is really, really important. And so I just want to say that, one of the things I'll always take away from my career has been, feeling grateful for the opportunity to work with these people who give so much of themselves. And some people never get that opportunity because they work in a very competitive dog eat dog industry or something. I've been fortunate to be able to do that, and hopefully, and I should also say, one of the bad things about the pandemic is that healthcare um, workers have had to, contend with some pretty bad behaviors. And I just want to sort of end this by saying, please treat your nurse and your doctor well. treat your physio well. Treat your social worker well.
Hello, my name's Lester.
And I'm Costas.
And welcome to What's with RWE, the Canadian Healthcare Podcast. So Costas, we've been talking for a long time now to try to get someone on who actually has run a hospital system or a health system. And we've been scouring around Canada for that person. And we are super fortunate today to have on almost like an extraordinary individual who has run so many health systems across Canada, Arden Krystal. So welcome to the podcast, Arden.
Thank you so much.
So Arden, maybe let's start off with, because you are somewhat of a superhero, maybe your origin story of how you came to, going from, I think you started out in nursing, I believe, and then subsequently you ended up at the very last job that you had before you semi-retired, running one of the kind of larger hospital systems in Ontario, Southlake. So maybe we can start us off a little bit from that perspective.
Yeah, it was a pretty humble beginning. I was a kid in high school, like a lot of kids in the 70s and early 80s, didn't quite know what I wanted to do, and figured I'll be a nurse. I had no healthcare people in my family, so it was a bit of an off the wall choice for someone in my family, but I figured I'd be well suited to it because I really, really enjoyed working with people. It did turn out to be a great choice for me. I really enjoyed working with people who were vulnerable. I started my career working in the cancer space with patients who had leukemia and lymphoma and needed bone marrow transplants and needed chemotherapy, et cetera. And so I do actually credit that first job with giving me a very solid appreciation of life and the contributions that I think all of us have the potential to make, as well as obviously work ethic and everything else. So as I progressed in my career, I tried a few different things. I was a clinical educator for quite some years. I enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed mentoring and coaching new people. And then soon realized that actually I thought when I watched, the frontline managers, I thought, you know what, I could do that. I'd like to do that. I'd like to take a coaching approach to healthcare administration instead of a more hierarchical kind of dictatorial approach, which was kind of the common thing back in those days. And so I went back to university, got my degree. In those days, nurses didn't need to have a degree, a diploma was enough. And I got my first managerial job at Vancouver General Hospital. Loved being a manager. Had over a span of several years, was manager in surgical oncology areas, in medical oncology, in solid organ transplant, in short stay surgery. And so I had a range of experiences. And it was at that time where I really knew I'd found my niche. I loved administration. I liked making change. The system can be incredibly hard to change. And so sometimes it's small incremental changes you can have, but I loved to have impact. I like to see, the staff grow. I like to be able to spot the stars and be able to really facilitate their development. And so I was at Vancouver General, which then became Vancouver Coastal Health for 19 years, and decided it was time to get out of my comfort zone because I'd been there ever since I'd graduated and moved to Fraser Health. And that's when I started to understand what really running a whole hospital was like, as opposed to one program or service. And when I first started, I had responsibility both for hospital administration, but also for public health in that area. And that was really new to me because I'd always been a hospital nurse and a hospital manager. It gave me a huge appreciation of how important system integration is.
Mm-hmm.
The hospital really is only one very small part of a patient's journey through the healthcare system. The big parts actually happen in the community. They happen in the family practice space, in the prevention space, in the home care space, long-term care, et cetera. So it gave me a good appreciation of that. And soon after that, I went into really big administration and became a vice president in Fraser Health. And I had responsibility for 13 hospitals across Fraser Health, which is a very large health authority in the suburbs of Vancouver. And I also had responsibility for all public health services within that area. So that was around a $1.5 billion budget, and a great span in terms of geography. It went all the way from Burnaby to Hope. So lots of driving around in that job. We did a lot of reorganization during that time. We moved to a system called program management, which meant that it was intended to get the hospitals working together much more synergistically,
Mm-hmm.
by aligning programs between hospitals. So, for example, the emergency was one program across 13 hospitals. Surgery was one program across 13 hospitals. And that was really to avoid competition, to make sure that we had consistent policy standards, quality of care, that big sites could really help small sites in different ways, and that we didn't have bottlenecks at some sites and capacity at other sites. So that was really important, and I was a big proponent of that change, and we made that change over that period of time. And then after about 7 years at Fraser Health, I moved to PHSA, which was the Provincial Health Services Authority. And that gave me, so I had kind of gone from being a middle manager in a hospital to understanding a hospital system to moving into the provincial realm. And so that I felt was important for my own development, in that it was kind of growing in scope and span and authority. And at PHSA, I had responsibility for all of the delivery agencies, of which there were many quaternary agencies in that: the Provincial Cancer System, Women's and Children's Hospitals, the BCCDC, and also mental health services. And then I had responsibility for what we call commissioning agencies. So those were agencies where PHSA didn't directly deliver the care, but they held the funding and they commissioned the health authorities to do it. So things like cardiac care, renal care, um, uh, transplant, those kinds of things. And then I also had responsibility for what we call the planning agencies. So those were agencies where they didn't deliver money, they didn't deliver services, but they really helped to set quality standards across the province for a variety of things. So, for example, something like Child Health BC, which set standards for pediatric care across the province, regardless of what health authority you were in. So that was really broad experience, and an opportunity came up to go to Ontario. My husband became a vice president at Sick Kids, and so we decided our kids were grown up and almost grown up, and maybe it was time for an adventure, because I was a BC girl, he was an Ontario guy, and we thought, let's try this. And it was actually really fun for me to go back to running just one organization as opposed to multiple. It gave me the opportunity to really get to know staff at the front line again, our physicians, um, our you know, to build a new team. Ontario was really changing at that time and trying to dip its toe into integration. And so we developed Ontario health teams over that period of time and some innovative programs. So that's kind of where I came from. It was, I would say, a very opportunistic um, type of pathway. I had never, ever, as a nurse, thought, oh, I'm going to be a CEO someday. Never, never crossed my mind. All I did was try to do the very best job I could in the position I was in. And when I felt like I was ready for a new opportunity, I took chances, and I sometimes took lateral moves in order to learn more stuff. But always through, I would say the thread running through everything was, this decision making around, will I learn something? Can I contribute something? And can I have impact? And I think that's sort of what has guided my career.
So Arden, that's a fantastic journey that you have been on. Can I go back to the days at Fraser Health? Because I think that, what was done there, so having multiple health authorities, it's sort of every day in places like the US right now, where you have so many integrated hospitals together, but it's not so much in Canada. So but it what were the things that I think helped you to be successful in that operation? Because clearly I think it worked. I think the sort of the integration of those different programs was
Hmm.
successful.
Hmm.
What do you think was the key to that success? What were the several keys? Probably it can't be attributed to one thing, but what was it for you that allowed you to actually leave that as a successful outcome in your journey?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it was taking the time to have the right collaboration with all of the players. As you can imagine, if you're a small hospital and all of a sudden now you have to be a part of this big program, and there's big tertiary hospitals, that kind of seem like they wield the power.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that can be an intimidating situation. And I think what we had to really help all of the players understand is that everybody was going to learn from everybody. It wasn't just the small hospitals that were going to gain all of the knowledge from the large ones. Sometimes large hospitals, and I experienced this when I went from Vancouver Coastal to Fraser. Coastal was really well funded because it had all of the big quaternary services there.
Yeah.
Fraser was growing like crazy and it wasn't as well funded. And so, you know, sometimes they had to be super creative and really efficient with the way that they did things versus when you have more supports. You learn to do one or two things, but you don't learn to do five things and be a jack of all trade because you don't have to. Whereas, at Fraser, I learned some new tricks that I wouldn't have learned ever at Coastal because someone else was doing that. I'll never forget my first day at Fraser. I was getting my orientation and I was saying, okay, so who's going to do that? And they would say, well, that would be you. Oh, who's going to do that? Well, that would be you. I was like, oh, okay, I guess I will. So that kind of a mentality was really important in the integration process between the small, the medium, and the large hospitals. And we really tried to create win-wins. And I think the biggest win during that time is that we were having incredible problems. If you were a small hospital, you were having big problems trying to transfer a patient that needed to be transferred to a higher level of care
Mm-hmm.
because the bigger hospitals would say, no bed, no bed, no bed. If you were a big hospital, you were having incredible trouble repatriating patients to those small hospitals. So that was one of the first things that we worked on because we wanted to get a quick win. We wanted them to see that actually they worked better together than when they were separate. So, we thought about the hot spots, which was like ED capacity issues and demand challenges, and that's what we focused on first.
Terrific.
Great. And actually, speaking about efficiency, I think this is a become somewhat of a hot topic, as you can imagine, down south, right? And as
Mm,
obviously it bubbles up north as
yeah.
well. This idea of efficiency, and that's something that one of the main reasons we're so interested in bringing on someone like yourself, who has such a long story career from an operations perspective, is really like to look into the operations of how a hospital system actually functions. To be quite honest with you, this is not meant to be it is a super naive question, but what
Mm.
did you at Southlake as the CEO of Southlake, like what was your day to day like? What did you do? And this is completely out of just ignorance from my part actually. And then from there, how did you, because now given the backdrop that healthcare is obviously strained in Canada, not just Canada, maybe across the world.
Yeah.
How do you make, I guess, set priorities given that there are so many
Mhm.
challenges? So I'm sure this can harken back to your days back at Fraser and probably Coastal Health. So maybe if you can expand a little upon that, maybe your how this is a start of like how was your day to day at
Yeah.
Southlake or at Fraser?
Well, I mean, there was kind of, I would say, my day would be split into two different pieces: the internal workings of the hospital and then the external system stuff that I was involved with, which all CEOs are. So, externally, that's liaising with some of your other hospital partners, your regional partners, working with the ministry, bureaucracy, politicians, both local and provincial, and working with external agencies that you really need to partner with in order to maintain the inner workings of your hospital. So, for example, if you don't have good relationships with your home care providers, with long-term care, etc., good luck trying to move patients out. And then you've got a real issue, a quality and safety issue within your hospital, as well as staffing issues and budget issues and everything else. The internal, usually what my day consisted of is, lots of meetings. um, I always tried to go on rounds, at least a few times a week at a minimum. That was important to me because I wanted staff to know that they could speak directly to the CEO. We would have things like town halls, which, once COVID hit, actually became virtual. And then when we moved back to in person, we filmed every single one to keep them virtual because we realized that so many people who work night shifts or something else would then have an opportunity to see it, and to be able to listen to the questions and answers. Um, Managing the budget is a very difficult thing in healthcare. The budgets are very constrained, and inflation, particularly post pandemic and during the pandemic, ran rampant. So, and inflation not only in supplies but in labor, and really in labor because of the labor shortages, pretty dramatic labor shortages that are still really being experienced worldwide right now, in health professionals, and meaning that then you get into paying a lot of overtime and everything else. And I think, populations, particularly in suburban areas, in outside of cities, growing so rapidly and aging so rapidly. And so when you've got that double whammy of growing population by number and aging, you've got a big problem on your hands. And governments have just not invested, pre-invested, to allow us to seamlessly deal with that. So we're always in catch-up mode. And so that's kind of what we deal with on a regular basis. And of course, dealing in Ontario, the system is individual hospitals with individual boards that are not government appointed, and so it's a bit of a different milieu there to work. But certainly, you have to make sure that you're accountable to the board, and that involves, having regular meetings, that kind of thing. So, I would say my regular day was, a combination of trying to look proactively and strategically to see if we're meeting our goals, but also putting out a lot of fires. And those fires could be labor issues, it could be quality issues, it could be complaints, it could be the ministry all of a sudden saying, we want you to do this right away with no money. So those kinds of things, that was pretty much par for the course.
That's great setup for now. Okay, this is another super naive question,
Yep.
and it's going to sound ridiculous actually at some point in time too. Actually, I'm sure it sounds ridiculous. It's going to sound ridiculous. Is how does the money even flow to the hospital itself?
Yeah.
Do you literally get like a big check, those ginormous fund size checks,
No.
like whatever, at the beginning of the year, or like how does
Sometimes
that
from
even work?
sometimes from the foundation we get a big check, but not from the ministry. So each province has a different formula for how they fund their system, right? And so in BC originally there was something called the population needs based formula, and so when they went to regionalization, they would adjust the global budget every year based on population inflows, and then adjust for things like number of seniors, that kind of indigenous populations, etc. And then also adjust for things like academic and teaching, special programs. And then it got to a point where they were carving off part of that global budget for specific programs, for example, for surgical waitlist reduction, for emergency flow. So they would have special funding that was carved off for those things. In Ontario, they have a similar type of funding. I would say there's more carve outs in Ontario. They will give you certain quotas for certain surgeries, for example, and certain types of cases, and they will pay a certain amount per case. The goal of the hospital is always to see, can I provide a quality product, and can I do it for less than how I'm funded, so that I can have a little bit of a surplus that I can then use to offset those areas where the funding does not cover my costs. And there's a lot of places where the funding does not cover your costs. And in Ontario, I think it was down to about 40% of the budget being global, and the rest were all for specific programs. So you can imagine that even if you have a pretty big budget, I think at Southlake our budget was something like 650 million. If only 40% of that is global, it doesn't leave you a lot of wiggle room to be able to do things. Now that was the operating budget. In BC, they actually did give you some money for capital. In Ontario, you're on your own in terms of capital. And so it's almost 100% funded either through foundations and charitable organizations, or you can use working capital for that if you have it. Um, and and even in BC, although they fund capital, it's never funded to the degree that you need. Um, and so a lot of times what happens is that it's really hard to get new capital, a net new you can replace, but it's really hard to get net new. And I would just say that, one of the challenges we have in Canada with our publicly funded system, in my opinion, is that um, we are not as efficient as we could be because we have not invested in capital as much as we should have. And so what that does is make us dependent on labor. And so we need more labor to do some of the same work because we don't have the technology and the capital to be able to do it efficiently. So I can give you an example. Now, this is now changed where they have this, but it's only been reasonably recently that hospitals have adopted mechanized medication distribution systems, for example. And I'm not talking about the ones on the nursing floors, I'm talking about the ones in the pharmacy. So actual robots that will distribute the meds and do it. It used to be all labor based. And so we have many, many processes in hospitals that are still like that have a lot of room for improvement. And if we only had the money, the technology is out there, but there just isn't the money to pay for it.
So, other than capital expenses, can you sort of give us a sense for the areas where the funding just really tends to run short? Like, are we talking pharmacy budgets? Is it staffing? Where else is it a struggle really to make up the differences?
kind of everywhere, I would say. Even labor. So let's say that, the government negotiates a contract with the provincial nursing union.
Yeah.
And they'll say that they decide to give them 2% a year. That's great. So they give 2% a year, and they will give us the 2%. What they don't give us is the money, that the proportion that we have to pay for benefits. So
Mm,
as you increase somebody's pay, we pay a certain proportion that is prorated, for benefits, and that's always an amount that we end up having to eat and
right.
carry, because it's never added to the total. So that's been something that year over year over year, you continue to have to eat it. It grows exponentially, over time, which is a regular feature, particularly for nursing, is usually never covered, unless it is, for example, something that you've structured into your budget for on call. So operating rooms, for example, on call over the night, that's a regular part of your schedule. That's part of your budget. But if it's just for overflow beds and things like that, unless they have specifically designated funding, and some oftentimes they do, they'll say, okay, we have extra funding this year. We'll fund your overflow beds, but only for 1 year. Next year, you're back to square one again. And right now there's a problem in Canada, but I would say particularly in Ontario, where there is a need for regulation of nursing agencies. So what these nursing agencies do is that they pop up and they hire the staff that have already been working in the hospitals. They're my staff, other my colleagues' staff, and they work part-time for these agencies, and they make double the money. And the agency charges the hospital triple the money, and they take the profit. And there's almost no regulation in this right now. And this is a big, big issue, and it's a big waste of money right now. And it could be regulated, but there seems to be some political challenges with doing that.
Wow.
Leave it at that. That's my opinion. Now that I'm retired, I can say it.
On that front, what is a nursing? I never heard of that. A nursing agency, is that a private entity, or is that just a almost like so it is a private entity?
Private entity, it's a private corporation. They hire staff. They then contract with a hospital or health authority. And so when you completely have tapped out on your own staff, you can't get any overtime, you can't do whatever, and you've got a full ICU of patients, that's your desperation move. And it used to be unheard of, but now they've cropped up everywhere. And there are long-term care facilities, for example, that 50% of their staff are agency staff. So think about the cost of that, to the system.
Wow. Yeah. So there's a lot of fires, basically, is what you're saying,
There's
in
a
a
lot of
hospital for
fires, and
financial.
I should just say that that creates a lot of quality issues, and that's the issue. Not that the nurses themselves can't, aren't good nurses, because they work for us, but think about if you're punted to a new hospital all the time. It takes a while to learn the systems and processes at that hospital, and anytime you don't know that very well and you're working in a fast-paced environment, the opportunity for error is there, and it definitely goes up the more agency staff you have. So that's a real problem. But to get back to your question, what else am I short in? Pharmaceuticals often, because there is group purchasing in Canada and in provinces, and that helps a lot. You will know that our drug costs in Canada are substantially lower than they are in the United States, and it's that group purchasing that really helps us with that, as well as our wide use of generics. But there'll be a new cancer drug, for example, on the scene, and you're not going to deny the patient, but now all of a sudden you're using a drug mid budget cycle that you haven't budgeted for, and so those things are cost overruns. You know, equipment that just breaks down that you didn't expect to break down, so you didn't have that in the budget. You only have so much contingency to pay for those things. Episodes like outbreaks. When you get an outbreak in your hospital, all of a sudden you're probably paying, 1.5 times in terms of in terms of staffing, in terms of cleaning, all of those things. So, you know, those are the things that cost us lots of money, and overflow beds, I would say, because if your emergency is so backed up and it's unsafe, you have to put people in beds, and then you have to staff those beds. You have to clean those beds. You have to provide food for those beds, all of those things. And that all costs money.
Wow. So given that that backdrop of you don't have a lot of money, you have tons of different fires to potentially put out. Like, how do you even prioritize what to focus on, and then how do you even make a decision in terms of investing in something? I know, just going back to Southlake as an example, you had sort of two things. I think at least I read in a couple of the news articles. One was a PET CT
Mm.
simulator.
Yep.
I'm not even sure what that is, but the other component is a program that you set up, like Southlake at Home
Yeah.
program. So how do you decide to, given again all the issues, there's lack of money, tons of issues. So how did you decide on focusing on these particular things, and then how did you actually even go into the mechanics of investing into them?
Yeah. So the first thing that I think is important to know, that even though there's so many fires to put out, it's still really important to have a strategic plan, to have, goals and objectives, and to try and align your your actions as much as possible with those, and not just always be reactive, because you never go forward if all you're doing is reacting. And so with investments, we always looked at what our priorities were for that year, that were designed with consultation with staff and physicians, with the board, with the community, et cetera. That's how you set your 5-year plan, as you go out and you consult. And then you also look at, what are the burning issues for us right now? What do the public care about? What do we care about? What patients care about? And so um, uh, we tried often to use a variation of a formula that allowed us to prioritize based on needs and not wants. And so what we did was we used a needs-based formula that actually ranked what proposals for how we wanted to spend money. So is this worth spending money on, or is this worth disinvesting in? Like, does it
Mm.
meet the test for disinvestment? And that's one of the things the healthcare system is very bad at. If you use a closet mentality, all we ever do is buy clothes. We hardly ever get rid of any. And so we need to learn to get rid of some, but those are noisy things sometimes. So we would do that kind of analysis every year and say, this is how we want to set the year. Now, Southlake at Home was something I would say I'm most proud of. And first of all, it was the first of its kind in the province. And it was based on what we were seeing, and also the direction that we thought that the healthcare system needed to go in. So what were we seeing? What we were seeing is that we had a lot of alternative level of care patients. So these are patients who, if the services existed for them, if they were able to get out of hospital, you would discharge them because their acute care stay had ended.
Right.
But there was nowhere to put them. So they would stay days and days and days in the hospital. And we had a significant number of patients who were not eligible for long-term care, but they were still ALC, and we couldn't get them out. So why couldn't we get them out? Well, at the time, we had a pretty rigid home care um, system where there were very, very rigid, structured types of services that patients would be slotted into. And if you
Mhm.
didn't fit the mold, then they didn't take you, or it took them forever to be able to actually move you through. And part of the problem was that discharges weren't being planned until like the day before discharge. And these patients are complex. These were we analyzed these ALC patients and realized that they had several things in common. They were old, the elderly, they were frail, they had multiple comorbidities, they often had some kind of social issues such as homelessness, poverty, lack of family support, you name it. And so it was difficult to get those people home because you couldn't find the right place for them where you could support them properly. And so we thought, we did an analysis as well about, well, how much, given the current system, would it cost to send that patient home? And we did all of our math and said, this is how much it would cost for home care, and this is how much it would cost for this transport, this and that. And we came up with a bundled funding formula. And then we reached out to a couple of the home care providers. One was a not-for-profit, private not-for-profit, and the other was a private for-profit. But we had good relationships with them. And we said, we did a request for proposal, and we said, who would like to join us in this pilot? I sought for government funding for this because this was not something that hospitals had done. The home care sector was very separate, and the hospitals were not in charge of doing that kind of work. And I had a great relationship with the minister at the time, which was Christine Elliott, and she said, let's give it a whirl. And so we got pilot funding, and we wanted to do some things differently as well, not just to move people out of the hospital, but to give them a better experience when they were out of the hospital, because we didn't want them readmitted, because these are the kinds of patients that often came right back, right? So what we did is we said, okay, you're going to get this much money, healthcare, home care organization, for 14 weeks of service. And you might find actually that you get the person completely independent within 10 weeks. If that's fine, you get to keep the rest of the money. You can spend the money at the front end, you can spend it at the back end, you can spend it the same amount every day. You can spend it on physio, nursing, home care, like like a patient aid or something. You can put food in their fridge. You can get their garage cleaned. You can, whatever's going to help them. You can give them transportation to the general practitioner. But whatever it is, it has to be the care plan for the patient. We have to agree on that. And when we identify this patient is likely going to be one of these Southlake at home patients, and we had discharge planners who would identify them within a day or two of their admission. And then they would call the home care agency and say, I want you to come in. Let's start the care planning for this person. Let's figure out what they need. And then they had several days lag time to be able to get these things in place. And there was constant communication between the discharge planner and the home care agency and the family practice. We partner with family practice that they'd be able to do phone appointments with these people. If the home care nurse, for example, came in and said, "Ooh, I'm worried they might go back to hospital. We need a doc now," we could get them an appointment that day. What was the benefit of it? Huge benefits. So first of all, the home care agencies loved the people within those agencies loved being able to do their jobs without the kind of harsh constraints that they had under the old system. They loved that. They loved the consistency, because one of the things we did is we split up our geography and said, this agency covers these towns, this agency covers this town. Why was that important? Because in Ontario, patient care aides get paid by the visit. They don't get paid by the day. So if you're driving all over the place, you can only do 6 visits, where if you're in a condensed area, you can do 8 visits. So then they can make more money. And that's important, because they were turning over all the time because they couldn't make enough money. And that turnover creates a lack of consistency for patients, which is really, really bad. It's not a good experience to have a different care provider every day. And so what this did is it created less turnover for the home care agencies, which actually saved the money. It created a better patient experience for the patient and allowed them to get better sooner, because these aides got to know their patients really well and could anticipate their needs, and the team all knew each other because they all stayed together and they worked together. So it was a total win-win, and I'm very pleased to say that it has spread across Ontario. And I'd like it to see it spread even more. I hope it will, but it was one of the things that I was really excited that we were able to do and really show its worth.
That's awesome. Out of curiosity, there, how long did that from inception of the idea till to pilot, and then now spreading across Ontario? Hopefully not as a pilot anymore, as a almost a
Yeah.
as a forever type of service. Like how long did that take?
Well, we actually constructed the pilot in 6 weeks.
Wow.
And, it was very fast by regular healthcare standards. But, we had a big overflow problem. We could not get patients out. We had patients who were waiting, up to, like, 18 days to get out of hospital of ALC. Within 6 months of doing the pilot, we had 0 ALC days in this population. So we saved hundreds and hundreds of days. And then we started to present it everywhere. The government got really excited about it. They started to approve more pilots, spreading out. We worked with other hospitals to tell them how we did ours. And then there was the person who was really, really key in this, a woman named Gail Seddon, who was one of my executive directors, developed a playbook for it, and then the government started to use that and send that out to other organizations. So it is a regularly funded program now.
That's terrific. So that was something where you were able to proactively create under your own sort of decision. You were, I think, overseeing Southlake during COVID, if I'm not mistaken, as
Yeah.
well.
Hmm.
And I think we all remember those times. We try to sort of put them in a box somewhere, maybe, but I think there must have been a lot of learnings out of COVID.
Hmm.
And what sort of after COVID did you keep? I mean, what were some of the learnings or the capabilities that the hospital decided this is something that we need going forward?
Yeah. Well, I would say that all hospitals really, we were slow adopters in Canada of virtual care.
Mhm.
And I think once COVID came, that kind of adoption became commonplace, and that didn't recede after COVID. We continued to do a lot of virtual care, family practice now. For example, if you call your doctor for an appointment, they'll triage it. Is it a phone appointment or does it have to be in person? And that would never happen before COVID. So those are really good things because it does allow for more efficiency. Things like work at home, we realized that we could um, retain, sort of millennials and Gen Xers better if we gave them more flexible schedules. When that was obviously, if you're a nurse at the front line, you're not going to go virtual. But if you worked in the back office and you were doing a variety of different things that were all computerized, why not have a day or two at home so that it makes things better? So I think those things stayed. What I'm disappointed in that didn't stay was that during the one thing I loved during COVID was, well, there was a couple of things, but one of the things I really loved was the fact that we had to make decisions so quickly that we got a lot more autonomy and a lot less bureaucracy in our decision making during that time. And, interestingly, nothing collapsed. Like we didn't all run amok. There wasn't, massive corruption. Like nothing bad happened by not having to report every single cotton picking thing. I'm sad to say, I think things have kind of gone back to it's pretty hard to get things done. And that's too bad. But that's one of the things that I think is difficult. The other thing that I think worked really well is that in Ontario, because they're not integrated hospital regions, the hospitals worked really well together during COVID and were much less competitive. And I think it's probably swung back to a little bit more competitive again. So, I'm not sure how helpful that is, but those are the things that I think are real learnings.
So, I've sort of grown up in the research world, and so when you say hospitals are competitive, I kind of get what that means.
Yeah.
For the folks that are listening to us, can you describe, because it's not like it is in the U.S., let's say, where you're
No,
competing for patients. Actually, it's the
no,
last thing you really want.
no.
But but what does competition look like in Ontario's hospitals, and just for a sense for people of you know but maybe it's one of the things that we need to think about, how do we fix, because there's a lot that can happen when everyone is working together and pulling in the
Yeah.
same direction.
Well, I mean, there's definitely competition for funding. I mean, the government only has one pot, and everybody wants their share of the pot
Mm-hmm.
as much as they can get, because it makes their job easier. And that goes for capital as well. And when I say capital, on the provincial funding side, I'm talking about new hospital builds or renovations. Like, there's incredible competition for that, and it is very political because every politician wants a new hospital in their riding that they can say, "Hey, I got you a new hospital." So that is challenging because, for example, my experience in British Columbia, although it is still political, everybody still wants a new hospital in the riding. At least if you're a hospital system with multiple communities and 13 hospitals, you can use a little bit more data driven decision making in terms of who needs the hospital the most.
Right.
And then you put forward your proposal to government. And so that's all they have to choose from. You know what I mean? Whereas this competition in Ontario creates a scenario where sometimes a town that maybe needs a hospital, but another town that really needed it way more doesn't get it because the wrong person is elected there. There's a bit of that. There's also huge competition for staffing, for physicians, for nurses, for allied health professionals, particularly in the GTA, because people can go from place to place. Less so if you're in one town where, if you live in that town, there's one hospital and that's where you work. Um, and now competition with these nursing agencies as well, right? So it's tough because we're just not producing enough um, nurses or doctors, and people aren't working as many hours as they used to. So, you wonder why physicians, for example, we are producing more family docs than ever. We're not getting the proportional number of hours. Why? Because 50% are women and they might go on mat leave and they might have a baby. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. I'm not dissing it. It's just a reality. But the expectations around the incremental value of the numbers that you put in training are wrong, because you have to expect that, if I'm going to have this proportion of women, then I have to train more, because they are going to take time off to be with their family. And some of the male physicians are doing the same thing because they can take paternal leave, because gone are the days where physicians want to work 70, 80-hour weeks. They don't want to. They want to be regular people, and so they should. And so we find the same thing sometimes in nursing where, they don't want to work full time. They might want to work three-quarter time instead. Well, then, if you produce one nurse, that means you need 1.25 nurses to be able to fill those hours. So, those are the things that are challenging in the system right now that require a lot of government support, because they're the ones that set the seats and fund the universities to be able to prepare these people.
Right.
Great. And you've spoken about this, you've mentioned this word a couple of times already, and maybe you can kind of somewhat define it for the folks on the podcast. Imagine there's billions of people watching and they're not familiar with it, but the term
Billions of
capital,
people watching. Oh my gosh.
well, of course, why wouldn't they
I
be?
didn't know
Because
your
Arden
podcast was
Krystal,
that popular.
no, only for you, Arden,
Oh,
not for
I
the
see.
costas,
Great.
only for
Awesome.
yourself. But the term capital, and then
Mm,
also given the backdrop of you have mentioned that we need to make probably more capital investments in the hospital or care setting. Like, how do we even go about doing that? What are some prescriptions that you may have, especially now given the backdrop of the so many things like everyone talks about AI, right? That you have AI doctors. I don't know. Maybe it's not going to happen this year, maybe not next year, but it's going to happen at some point where there's an AI assistant or something along those
yes.
lines. So how do we in Canada get almost ahead of that, given that we have a labor shortage, these labor dynamics that are quite unique? How do we drive that efficiency by investing more capital into
Yeah.
the system? Go
Well,
ahead.
I mean, what we really need is a pretty major transformation. Now, I'm hopeful because of some of the policy directions that I see coming out from the federal government, which is, I think, a recognition that, I mean, my zone is healthcare, but I think this is a problem across Canada, and it's one of the reasons why we have not, we have not been as efficient as a nation as we could be, because we have, during a time where labor was everywhere, we relied on labor, and
Mhm.
it was reasonably cheap. And now labor is really expensive. And so it's not smart to rely on labor anymore. Yes, we'll always need labor, but we need technology that makes that labor the most efficient, use of it as possible. And so we've got a ways to catch up. Information systems are still not where they need to be in hospital. There's still no communication between hospitals and home care in terms of flow of information in most places. That's different in some of the regionalized provinces. Um, you talk about AI assistance. It's very much in its infancy in terms of actual use case in healthcare right now, but we should be using AI for assisting, for example, with triage. In EDs, we have a triage nurse and or two, depending on their volumes. There's no reason why we shouldn't have AI programs to be able. You're still going to need the nurse, but she could probably triage a whole lot faster if we had some of those systems, right? Same with radiology, same with a number of different diagnostic tools, for example. In terms of capital, we have old hospitals, some that are like 100 years old, and they've all been like retrofitted and everything. And so what's happened is that the labor that we have are used to working in really inefficient ways because they've had to do workarounds to compensate for what they don't have in technology. And so if you had like skookum hospitals that were really efficient, step efficient, for example, that didn't require you to walk a lot further to be able to get what you need, that where you wouldn't be able to, you didn't have to search for supplies and equipment, where you had enough operating rooms, for example, that surgeons could flip from room to room, instead of having to wait for the turnover between a room in terms of sterilization and cleaning. You could save a lot, and you would need less. We wouldn't have to, we've got labor shortages, so this wouldn't be about, I'm not a fan of getting rid of labor, but what it would help us do is mitigate some of those shortages, by using the people we do have in a much more effective way. And I think industry across Canada needs to do this, and so if the feds have a way maybe of doing some of this investment, that would be amazing.
So, Arden, one of the questions that pops up, and maybe we've seen it not in such a private or sorry, such a positive light with the private nursing groups and how that's been rolled out. But
Mm.
does a public private, uh, let's say, approach where you sort of bring the two together? Because I don't know that the government is going to be able to do this on their own or to be acceptable from a tax standpoint. But is there a role for private in the solutions that are necessary, especially on the capital side of the equation?
Well, there has to be, because it's actually like startup tech firms and others that are developing the technology right now that we need. But many of them have no entry point into the system. They can't get through the barriers to be able to get their technology in use, and that's important because a lot of this technology, it's great on paper, it's great in the lab. You got to test it out in the real life situations to be able to refine it properly. If you can never get it in, then we're never going to develop here. So you got to develop those partnerships. That's important. And I would even say, in terms of delivery, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Only about 70% of what we do in Canada is publicly delivered. The rest is privately delivered. And that's for a reason. Some of us have extended health plans where, I can pay for a physio if I want to go to physio. I don't have to get it through the public system. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think there is an issue, when you start to develop um, uh, copycat services. So if we already have good public services in a particular arena, if you develop private that are the same thing, all that's going to happen is you're going to suck staff from the public system into the private system.
Right.
But where we really need to use private is where it's really hard to do that work in public systems. And, technology exploration is one of those things. And, pharmaceutical research might be one of those things. Like there are a lot of opportunities to work collaboratively with tech partners and other private partners.
Great.
Great. Given the, we don't want to take too much of your time. You've been very generous of your time, and I know you're going on vacation soon, so I know you're going to look forward to that. Maybe just end things off. I know you only you say you're retired, but you're only semi-retired. You still have like so many consulting gigs, right? I think you're consulting with, obviously, through yourself, right? The Arden Krystal, let me see, Arden Krystal Coaching Consulting. You're also a senior advisor at Carnarvon Strategies. I don't know if I butchered that. Is that how you
Carnarvon.
pronounce it? Perfect. And what would you say are the maybe one or two things that you're maybe hopeful for from an investing perspective, or from a, I don't know, like optimistically looking at the healthcare system, given that there's so many of these challenges? What do you see down the horizon? It's like, I don't know, you give the time frame that you're very, very hopeful for.
Um, well, I think that so I would say that there are still opportunities in healthcare to disinvest in low value activities. And I think that we have not been good at that, as I mentioned before, because those are noisy things. But I think as the system gets into more crisis, that is going to become absolutely necessary. And that's not a bad thing. Um, you know, we need to do that in a very sensitive way. We need to do that, understanding that that the public have expectations, but also by managing those expectations. And when I say that, I just mean that we know that we spend the majority of our healthcare dollars in the last years of someone's life, and sometimes that's the right spend because it's on things like hospice and other things. Sometimes it's the wrong spend in that we are actually hurting people by keeping them alive when we should be facilitating. And I'm not talking about MAID or anything, but I'm talking about trying to manage their symptoms as they decline, as opposed to, you know, offering hope where there isn't. And I know that that probably sounds, and there may be listeners out there that are going like, what is she talking about? Euthanasia? I'm not talking about that, but I've seen as a nurse, I've seen as an administrator, many scenarios where it is rightly very difficult for family to let go, but it's really not. It's a moral dilemma for the team because they do not believe that the pain and suffering of the patient is the right thing to do. So there are decisions like that where we need to sort of say, as a society, like, what are we doing here? What's the healthcare system for? And what is the top priority that we can't let go of? Like, we need to have an emergency room. Like, if you get into a car accident and you chop your leg off, like, you need to be treated. And so we can't spend our money in a place where we can't be able to do that. So, and we can't do everything. The population's growing and aging. We will not be able to keep doing the same things that we're doing. If we insert technology, we might be able to really, really do some incredible things and make strides where we couldn't before. For example, in early diagnosis, which then allows us, so if we could treat cancers, if we could detect them even sooner, think about how much money you save in the treatment protocols, and how much quality of life you gain. Like, it's a win-win. So that's, I think, where I think sometimes the system has to hit bottom before the push comes to make those transformational changes that are really, really important to make. And I think we're headed in that direction. So I know that's a little bit negative, but I always think there's a positive out of a negative, just like COVID. It was a hard time, but there were some really positive things that came out of that. I think there's going to be positive things that come out of this too, but I do think we're in for a few more rough years of challenges.
Great. Yeah, appreciate that very, very much. It's a very, it seems like very practical suggestions that you're making, and obviously, uh, not to say that the disinvestment just sounds very, very like somewhat harsh, but as an
Yeah.
example within the healthcare system, the healthcare system must be the only people that still use faxes, right? Someone's got to
I
figure a
know.
way to like get rid of like faxes, right? That's got to
But
be
that's a technology problem, right? That's
yes,
the tech.
Yes.
We haven't invested in the technology that properly that would allow us to get rid of faxes. And we're not integrated. Like if we were properly integrated with our information systems between all of the pharmacies and all of the doctor's offices and all of the specialist offices in the hospital and home care, you wouldn't need a fax. You just
Yep.
email them, or you know, have an online form that you complete.
Yeah, it's crazy. It must those fax machines. The makers of fax machines must only make money off of like hospital systems
I
from
think so.
nowadays. I think, right?
Yeah.
But again, thank you very much for your time, Arden. Costas, do you have any other questions for Arden before we jump off?
Yeah, I don't want to take any more time. This has been really, really amazing insight into hospitals, all the inner workings at the top, and the challenges that I think
Yeah.
we face today and have to figure out.
And can I just say one, I just like to leave and say one thing because, you know, I've talked a lot in the big picture about labor and capital and all of that. But, you know, the healthcare system, in my view, wouldn't be the system it is without the people. And it's these aren't easy jobs that they do.
Mhm.
And most of them really like doing it. They want to be of service, and that commitment to service is really, really important. And so I just want to say that, you know, one of the things I'll always take away from my career has been, you know, feeling grateful for the opportunity to work with these people who give so much of themselves. And some people never get that opportunity because they work in a very competitive dog eat dog industry or something. I've been fortunate to be able to do that, and hopefully, and I should also say one of the bad things about the pandemic is that healthcare um, workers have had to, you know, contend with some pretty bad behaviors. And I just want to sort of end this by saying, please treat your nurse and your doctor well. Treat your physio well. Treat your social worker well. You know, make sure that you thank the escort when they move you from place to place because you know, these people are doing hard jobs.
Well said. Thank you.
Absolutely. So if people want to find out a little bit more about what you're up to, so I noticed that you have a website
I do.
at akrystalconsulting.com. We'll put it in the show notes below. Is there any
Great.
other way that people should find you, like LinkedIn, Twitter, some sort of social media?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter anymore for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm on LinkedIn, and so yeah, happy for people to get in touch with me. And I do. We didn't really talk about it, but I did train as an executive coach because I love to coach and mentor new leaders, and we really need them in the system. So I'm available for that as well.
Excellent. We'll put those in the
Fantastic.
show notes. So thank you everyone for watching today. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment below, ask a question below, like, subscribe, and of course we'll put everything in the show notes, Arden, so that people can reach out to you
Awesome.
as well from a coaching and an executive training perspective. So thank you very much again, Arden, and thanks a lot, Costas.
Thank you
Appreciate
to
it.
you both. Have a great